The mousy nurse. That's what they called her in the break room when they thought she couldn't hear. The mousy nurse who never spoke during shift handover, who ate lunch alone with her eyes on a clipboard, whose shoes squeaked methodically down the fluorescent-lit corridors of Cedar Creek Medical like clockwork. They didn't know. None of them knew. And that was exactly how Captain Megan O'Brien needed it to stay. She had arrived in Savannah 3 years ago with a folded flag tucked into a sealed envelope and orders burned into her memory by a 2-star general: disappear into the civilian world, build an identity nobody would ever look twice at, and never surface again. The operation that should have died in the mountains of Kandahar had been buried instead, classified so deep that her own service record existed only in redacted fragments locked behind Pentagon firewalls. The flag, neatly creased, weighted with grief that never quite dulled, lived in a lockbox at the bottom of her work locker, hidden beneath spare scrubs and compression socks. Nobody asked questions about the quiet ones. Nobody noticed. It was the perfect place to rebuild a life that no longer existed. Cedar Creek Medical's night shift moved through its own rhythm, separate from the daylight world of grand rounds and administrative efficiency. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead, a sound so constant it became white noise against the softer backdrop of ventilators and cardiac monitors. Antiseptic hung in the air, that sharp, chemical brightness that Megan had learned to filter out years ago in field hospitals where blood and dirt and worse things stained concrete floors. She moved through the ICU corridors with the kind of invisibility that only came from practice, her scrubs immaculate despite 12 hours on her feet, her badge clipped to the exact center of her collar, her clipboard held at waist level like a shield. Room 7. Room 8. Room 9. The routine of rounds was meditation, each patient a puzzle to be documented with precision, each vital sign a story written in numbers and careful notation. Her charting was meticulous to the point of obsession. Every supply pulled from the crash cart was logged with timestamp and quantity. Every medication administered documented with dosage, route, time, and her initials. Every procedure note included specifics that would have seemed excessive to any reasonable nurse: the exact position of the needle insertion, the depth of penetration, the precise milliliter reading on the syringe. But Megan's hands had once held lives together in places where documentation meant nothing, where the difference between a correctly placed needle and a guess meant whether a soldier made it to the transport helicopter or died in the dust. The muscle memory of that training never left. It lived in her hands, in the way she moved, in the obsessive detail she poured into every shift. It was the only part of her old life that she let breathe in this new one, and she didn't even realize she was doing it. The break room smelled like cold coffee and the ghost of someone's microwave lunch from hours earlier. Megan sat in the corner, back to the wall, her own food untouched on the table in front of her. It was 2:17 a.m., she'd already checked 3 times. The other nurses passed through in clusters, their conversations a kind of background static she'd learned to filter. Mentions of overtime pay, complaints about the resident physicians, gossip about who'd called in sick. Sometimes they looked at her and nodded politely. Most times they didn't look at all. That was fine. That was the point. Invisibility was survival. Megan's left hand rested on the table, and without thinking about it, her right hand unconsciously traced the scar tissue that ran up her forearm beneath the long sleeves she wore year-round, even in Savannah's humid summers. 3 parallel lines, thin but distinct, from the pressure cuts of a tourniquet applied during the operation at Kandahar. Muscle memory for the fingers too. Her left hand trembled slightly, a tremor that came and went, worse when she was tired or the barometric pressure shifted. A somatic remnant of shrapnel that had lodged somewhere the surgeons decided was too close to the brachial nerve to safely remove. But the moment her hands touched medical equipment, a syringe, a stethoscope, a crash cart, the tremor vanished. Disappeared like it had never existed. Her body knew the difference between civilian routine and operational necessity. The flag was in her locker. The scars were under her sleeves. The rank that no longer belonged to her was burned so deep into her nervous system that she sometimes caught herself moving like she was still in uniform. Small things. Dangerous things, if anyone was looking carefully enough. But nobody was looking. That was the arrangement. The agreement. The promise she'd made in exchange for the chance to disappear. Dr. Pierce walked into the break room at 2:34 a.m. like he owned the fluorescent lights and the stale air itself. He was the kind of man who filled a room not through volume but through entitlement, a presence like a tank idling in a garage, all contained power and the implicit threat of motion. His lab coat was pristine, his silver hair swept back with precision, his jawline the kind that could cut glass if you gave it the right angle. Chief of surgery at Cedar Creek for the past 7 years, medical school at Johns Hopkins, credentials that filled the hospital newsletter and inspired the kind of institutional trust that came from reputation carefully maintained through relationship cultivation. He moved toward the coffee maker with the ease of someone who'd made that journey 1,000 times, and his eyes happened to pass over Megan in the corner. For exactly 1.3 seconds, his gaze lingered. She saw the moment his expression shifted. The clinical assessment. The recalibration of whatever calculation he'd been running through his mind. He said nothing. He filled his coffee cup with a dark liquid that had been sitting on the warmer for hours, turned, and left. But something had changed in the room's atmosphere, a pressure shift so subtle that only someone trained to read micro-expressions and body language would have noticed. Megan noticed. By 3:17 a.m., a patient in room 12 began the kind of decline that nobody could quite articulate until it was already happening. Mr. Chen, 68 years old, post-op cardiac, had seemed stable during the 1:11 a.m. rounds. His vitals were acceptable, his rhythm was sinus and regular, his oxygen saturation was hovering right around 96% on 2 liters of supplemental oxygen through nasal cannula. At 3:04 a.m. his oxygen saturation began a slow drift downward. 94, 92. 90. The monitor started its soft alarm, not urgent, not yet, but the kind of notification that meant something had shifted. At 3:12 a.m. Mr. Chen's breathing became shallow, his work of breathing increased, and Megan was already moving before the code blue button needed pressing. She moved with the kind of fluid precision that came from repeating the same motions hundreds of times, from training where hesitation meant body bags. Her hands flew through the crash cart, 14-gauge angiocath needle in the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the hiss of air escaping as the needle decompressed the tension pneumothorax that had silently filled his left chest cavity. The sound was like letting pressure out of a tire, and the effect was immediate. Mr. Chen's breathing eased. His oxygen saturation began to climb. 88, 92. 96, his face, which had gone the grey-blue color of insufficient oxygen, began to pink up. The monitor's alarm stopped its insistent beeping. Sinus rhythm. The code card wasn't even fully pushed into the room when she'd already stabilized him, the entire crisis resolved in the time it took most people to wake up from the initial alarm. One of the residents stared at her with the kind of expression usually reserved for people who'd just performed minor miracles. "Where the hell did you learn that?" His voice carried the particular tone of someone who'd just realized they might have been underestimating the quiet woman in scrubs. Megan was already moving back to the medication cabinet, her movements economical and precise. "Experience," she said quietly. That was all. One word. It was the most she'd spoken to anyone since morning shift report, and it was too much. Too revealing. Too specific in ways that invited follow-up questions. She felt the resident stare like a weight, but she didn't turn around. The needle decompression had been a textbook procedure, any competent nurse with experience in emergency medicine should have been able to execute it. The fact that she'd done it with the certainty of someone who'd performed the same procedure dozens of times in places where equipment failures weren't surprises but standard operating procedure, that was something she needed to dial back. That was the kind of detail that caught attention. But attention had already been caught. In his office on the 3rd floor, Dr. Pierce was looking at Megan's charting. Patient documentation spanning 3 years, thousands of entries, every single one executed with the same meticulous precision. The supply logs were what had first caught his notice. A nurse who documented with that level of obsessive detail was either pathologically anxious or someone whose training had instilled a kind of operational rigor that belonged in field medicine, not a Savannah hospital. The medication records were even more interesting. Her dosages were always exact, her techniques were always by the book, her procedures carried the hallmark of someone who'd performed them under conditions where documentation meant the difference between a court-martial and a commendation. But it was her post-op charting that had really made him pause. The billing inconsistencies he'd embedded into his phantom procedures, the inflated supply costs for devices that were charged but never used, the phantom lab work that padded patient files and funneled kickbacks from medical device manufacturers into accounts he'd established through shell companies registered in Delaware, they should have been invisible. They were designed to be invisible, buried in the noise of thousands of legitimate charges, just slightly off-kilter enough to be undetectable by the standard audit algorithms. Except Megan's charting was so precise, so detailed, so obsessively aligned with actual patient care rather than billable codes, that the inconsistencies stood out like red marks on an otherwise perfect exam. She'd flagged 17 supply discrepancies in a single note about a patient's post-operative recovery. 17. She'd cross-referenced device inventory logs with billing records. She'd included questions about why particular items were being charged when they hadn't been used. 17 innocuous questions buried in the kind of thorough documentation that looked like the obsessive care of an exceptionally detail-oriented nurse, but that a careful reader would recognize as preliminary discovery. She was beginning to piece it together. He was sure of it. His phone was in his hand before he'd made a conscious decision to make the call. He had mentors at Johns Hopkins, colleagues at Georgetown, professional relationships that stretched back 2 decades and had weathered every storm they'd ever encountered because they were built on mutual benefit and institutional loyalty. His brother-in-law was the district attorney. His golf partners included 2 city council members. His referral network in medical device manufacturing included senior executives who owed him favors worth considerably more than his annual salary. He had built an empire of interconnected relationships and institutional leverage, and he had built it precisely for moments like this one, when a minor inconvenience needed to be eliminated before it became a liability. Dr. Pierce made a call to the chief of HR. He didn't mention Megan by name. He didn't detail her charting anomalies or express his concerns about her pattern of flagging discrepancies. Instead, he spoke with the calm professionalism of a senior physician discussing a staffing concern with a colleague. "I'd like to discuss the new hire in ICU," he said, and the tone was conversational, almost casual. "I'm beginning to develop some concerns about her fit with the hospital's culture." In the space of that single sentence, delivered with the kind of casual authority that came from 7 years of being listened to without question, the decision had been made. The machinery had begun to turn. The quiet nurse with the meticulous charting and the hands that moved with military precision had just become a problem that needed solving. Grand rounds on Thursday morning. 20 medical students crowded into the conference room at Cedar Creek Medical, clipboards clutched like shields, eyes fixed on the projection screen where Dr. Pierce stood with the presence of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. 6 attending physicians flanked him, colleagues, allies, the infrastructure of his power. The air smelled like fresh coffee and institutional antiseptic, the kind of sterile confidence that only comes with tenure and a spotless reputation built on someone else's work. Megan stood in the back corner, near the door, where she always positioned herself during these sessions. Visible but not prominent. Present but easily forgotten. She'd learned this geometry of invisibility over 3 years in Savannah, after trading one kind of uniform for another. Pierce tapped the remote. Megan's patient notes materialized on the screen, her documentation from a post-operative cardiac case. Detailed. Meticulous. The kind of charting that caught inconsistencies in supply usage if you knew how to read the margins between what was documented and what was billed. "This," Pierce announced, gesturing at the screen like a prosecutor presenting evidence, "is what happens when we prioritize paperwork over patient outcomes." His voice carried the timbre of absolute authority, each word landing like a gavel. Nurse O'Brien spent 43 minutes, I counted, documenting the exact quantity and placement of surgical sponges, gauze pads, electrocautery settings. 43 minutes on supplies that any competent OR nurse can manage in 5. Laughter rippled through the room. Knowing laughter. The sound of hierarchy reinforcing itself. "Some people," Pierce continued, his eyes finding hers in the back corner for exactly 1 deliberate second, "are simply more suited to paperwork than patient care. Medical transcription. Filing. The administrative tracks. Not everyone has the psychological fortitude for high-pressure clinical environments. He smiled at the students as if delivering wisdom. It's not weakness. It's self-knowledge. Megan's jaw clenched so tight a muscle twitched along the angle of her mandible. But her hands remained perfectly still at her sides, hanging loose in a way that cost her tremendous effort. Her breathing stayed steady, the kind of controlled inhale that comes from having learned to process trauma in real time, from having made decisions that cost lives when panic was the alternative. Her face remained blank as hospital walls. Empty. Unreactive. The student scribbled notes. One of them, the eager-looking third year from Johns Hopkins, actually underlined something on his clipboard as if Pierce's cruelty was clinical insight worth recording. Maybe our little church mouse should consider a career change, Pierce said, the nickname sharp as a scalpel. Less stressful. More aligned with her actual capabilities. The students exchanged glances. Some uncomfortable. Others, the ones who understood that cruelty was a networking opportunity, laughed louder. Megan's eyes didn't flicker. She didn't look away, but she didn't hold his gaze either. Her mind was somewhere else, a space she'd learned to access during interrogations, during the after-action reports of operations gone wrong, during the moment she'd watched a soldier from her unit come home in a flag-draped box. Dissociation wasn't weakness. It was a tool. It was survival. The session continued for another 17 minutes. Pierce moved on to other topics, other examples, but the damage was precise and intentional. By the time the students filed out, taking their notes and their hypotheses about Nurse O'Brien's unsuitability for crisis management, the architecture of her professional destruction was already in place. 3 hours later. The basement vending machine corridor, the kind of institutional space that existed in shadows, where the hum of fluorescent lights mixed with the mechanical grind of cooling motors. Megan was alone, reaching for a bottle of water, when she heard footsteps. Pierce appeared from the stairwell, not coincidentally. Nothing Pierce did was coincidental. He timed this. Waited for the day's shift to thin, for the night crew to disperse, for the moment when the corridor would be empty except for passing orderlies who wouldn't think twice about witnessing a conversation between a doctor and a nurse. His voice was different here, softer on the surface, edged with a kind of solicitude that was somehow more menacing than volume. Megan, I'm trying to help you understand your limitations. He positioned himself between her and the exit. Some people simply aren't built for high-pressure medical environments. I've been doing this for 22 years. I can recognize patterns of stress-triggered avoidance. She didn't respond. Just retrieved her water, turned toward the exit. You freeze during codes, he continued, his voice rising now, letting the orderlies hear. You overdocument because you're terrified of making real clinical decisions. That's not confidence. That's anxiety masquerading as diligence. He stepped closer, closing the distance with the confident physicality of a man who'd never been told to stop. If you can't handle constructive criticism without running away, maybe security should escort you out. Save us all the embarrassment of watching this play out over the next few months. Her hand trembled once, barely perceptible, a microscopic vibration in the fingers holding the water bottle. Then it steadied. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the sound of a woman holding back something that had been trained into her bones, something that lived in muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. She walked past him without a word, her shoulder brushing his arm with the precision of someone who'd calculated the exact angle. The contact lasted 0.8 seconds. To anyone watching, it looked like she'd simply moved through the narrow corridor. To Pierce, it was a reminder that she'd made a choice not to end him. That silence wasn't surrender. That composure was its own kind of power. The next morning. Shift change at 7:03 a.m. Megan arrived to find her assignment altered. The patient she'd been caring for, the complex post-operative cases, the ones requiring detailed monitoring, had been reassigned to other nurses. She was given for admissions in the urgent care wing instead. Routine. Uncomplicated. The kind of work that didn't require the kind of documentation she excelled at, didn't provide the opportunity to identify inconsistencies that might interest a billing auditor. Pierce made the announcement in front of the entire morning shift. 23 staff members, all present, as he spoke in his clinical voice, "Church Mouse, you're being moved to accommodate our scheduling needs. The acute cases are really better suited to nurses with more traditional stress management protocols. No offense intended. Just optimizing departmental resources." The nickname. Used 3 times across 2 sentences. A pattern of humiliation designed to normalize diminishment. Megan accepted the new assignment with a single nod. She picked up her new charts, moved to the urgent care station, and began her charting with the same meticulous attention that had drawn Pierce's attention in the first place. Her hands moved with precision. Her documentation was exact. Every medication, every vital sign, every clinical observation recorded with the muscle memory of someone whose life had once depended on accurate field reports. But that night, at 11:16 p.m., while she was checking a patient's post-operative dressing, her neighbor in bed 8, a grizzled man named Torres, admitted 3 days ago with shrapnel complications from an IED injury sustained in Helmand Province in 2009, watched her perform an emergency needle decompression when his oxygen saturation suddenly dropped and the attending physician was in another crisis 3 rooms over. The procedure was flawless. She'd identified the tension pneumothorax in 11 seconds flat, knew exactly where the second intercostal space was, midclavicular line. She'd used an 18-gauge angiocath because that was what was available and it was sufficient, had guided the needle with the kind of certainty that only comes from having done this under fire, with shrapnel overhead and screaming in the next tent. She'd secured the needle, controlled the release of pressure, monitored his O2 saturation as it climbed, 72, 78, 84, 91. Sinus rhythm. Stable. Torres's eyes widened as he watched her tape the catheter in place, as she documented the procedure with the same meticulous notation she used for everything. After she left, after his daughter had arrived to sit with him, he'd leaned over to her and whispered something that would send a ripple through Cedar Creek Medical by the next morning. "That's not a standard nursing technique. That's not anything I've seen in 15 years of watching civilian medical care. That's special operations medicine. Who the hell trained her?" But that night, Megan drove home through rain-slicked streets, her hand still steady on the wheel, her mind already compartmentalizing the moment. Compartmentalization was what had kept her alive in Kandahar. Compartmentalization was what had allowed her to return home and work as an anonymous nurse in a hospital where no one asked questions about the way she moved or the things her hands seemed to know without being taught. She had no idea what was about to happen. Tuesday night at Cedar Creek Medical moved like any other shift until it didn't. The ER sat in that peculiar calm that comes just before midnight, when the fluorescent panels cast their pale institutional glow across empty waiting rooms and the intercom crackled only with routine page announcements. Megan was restocking the supply cart on the 4th floor when the sound arrived, not the usual chaos of an incoming ambulance or the controlled urgency of a code announcement, but something rawer. The crash echoed up through the stairwell like a gunshot in a canyon. She didn't hesitate. Her hands moved to her pockets, checking, muscle memory from another life, another place where checking your pockets meant checking your ammunition. She was already moving toward the stairwell when the second crash came, louder, followed by the sound of the triage desk splintering. Glass shattered. Someone screamed. The intercom erupted with a dispatcher's clipped voice, "Security to ER, we have an active disturbance, possible weapon, all staff secure positions." By the time Megan reached the ER entrance, the man was already inside. 250 pounds of ramped methamphetamine and rage, his pupils dilated so wide they swallowed his irises, his breathing the rapid shallow gasps of someone whose central nervous system was running on chemical fire. The tire iron in his right hand hung like an extension of his arm, and the triage desk behind him was no longer a desk, it was splinters and twisted metal and the shattered computer monitor that had been booking patients 5 seconds earlier. His shirt was soaked with sweat that smelled like chemical burn and copper, the smell of someone who'd been cooking methamphetamine for 36 hours straight and believed he had superpowers. "I need my script," he screamed, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. "Oxycodone. Now. Now. He swung the tire iron again, not at anyone in particular, just swinging at the air, at the world, at whatever internal demon had hijacked his nervous system. The metal made that sound again, the sound of something expensive being destroyed with indifference. The staff reaction was textbook. The charge nurse locked the medication room. The triage clerk dove behind the counter. 2 paramedics backed toward the secure hallway. Marcus, the orderly who'd been processing intake forms at the far end, stood frozen, not panicked, just frozen, the way prey animals go still when they see the predator's head turned toward them. His eyes were wide. His clipboard fell to the floor with a clatter that sounded impossibly loud. Megan was 10 feet away when the man's attention shifted to Marcus. Not because Marcus had done anything. Just because Marcus was there, was standing alone, was suddenly the most real thing in the room worth destroying. The man's breathing changed. His grip on the tire iron tightened. He took 2 long strides toward the orderly, the chemical aggression in his movements the kind that didn't care about consequences because the reward center in his brain had been chemically lobotomized for the past 36 hours. She didn't run. She walked. The movement was unhurried, her breathing steady, her voice when she spoke was pitched low and even, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. Hey! 1 word. Just that. But there was something in the way she said it that made the man's head turn. Some quality of presence that made the air pressure shift, the way the atmosphere changes before lightning strikes. That's not the way, she said. Her hands were open and visible, palms up, but there was nothing submissive about the posture. I know what you need. I can help. He looked at her for the first time, really looked, not like she was a target or an obstacle or another person in the room, but like she was suddenly the only thing that mattered. His eyes locked on hers. Dilated, dangerous, chemical. A predator's stare wrapped in pharmaceutical mania. She didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Her jaw was loose. Her breathing was matched to his, slightly elevated but controlled, the breathing of someone in combat who understands that panic is a luxury. You can't help me. His voice cracked. Nobody can help me. I can, she said. But you have to listen. Can you listen? He raised the tire iron slightly. Not at her. Just up, a gesture of frustration and chemical rage. She read his pupils, read the tremor in his hands, read the way his weight was distributed on his feet. She understood what he was going to do approximately 1.7 seconds before he did it, recognized the microtelegraphing in his shoulders, the breath he was about to take, the precise moment when his cognitive function would drop below the threshold necessary to stop his body from completing the motion. When he committed to the swing, his knee was undefended. Most people don't think about their knees during moments of violence. They think about fists and weapons and the target in front of them. But a knee is just an assembly of tendons and ligaments and bone arranged in a way that works beautifully until it doesn't. Her movement was economical, no wasted motion, no flourish, just physics applied with the precision of someone who'd trained with people whose lives depended on that precision. Her leg swept his supporting leg, and she felt the joint collapse underneath him with the sickening give of ligaments failing. He went down hard. The tire iron clattered away from his hand and rang against the linoleum like a bell. His scream was pure animal, not pain initially, just shock, his body's outrage at gravity and physics and the sudden removal of his vertical relationship with the floor. Megan had the grip established before he could roll, his arm secured, his body controlled, her positioning making it impossible for him to generate any force that mattered. By the time security rushed in, boots thundering on the tile, the man was already neutralized, already groaning, already reduced from chemical monster to a human being having the worst day of his life. Security took over the physical restraint. Megan stepped back, her breathing still controlled, her hands moving to her pockets in that old habit that would take years to break even though she'd left that life 3 years ago. She could feel Marcus staring at her. Could feel the charge nurse staring at her. Could feel the weight of what had just happened settling over the ER like fallout. Dr. Pierce arrived 47 seconds later, his face already arranged in the expression of someone who'd been looking for an excuse. His eyes took in the scene, the destroyed triage desk, the restrained patient, the staff still half-hidden in secure positions, and Megan standing in the center of it all like the eye of a storm that had already passed. His jaw tightened. His hands formed fists. She watched him calculate something behind his eyes, watched the moment he decided that this moment of absolute justification, this moment where she'd saved the life of a staff member, this was the leverage he needed. "My office," he said. Not a request. A command. His voice had that sharp edge that meant he'd already made his decision before walking through the ER doors. Now. The hallway to his office was quiet, the kind of quiet that came from everyone else already sensing which direction this was going. His door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like a lock catching. He didn't sit. He stood behind his desk and pulled out a form, his hands moving with the precision of someone who'd done this before, written people up, documented them into corners, used the machinery of institutional power like a knife. "Reckless engagement without proper protocol," he said, the words already written on the form in front of him. His pen moved across the paper in short, deliberate strokes. Endangerment of staff and patients. Failure to follow emergency procedures. Assault on a patient experiencing a medical and psychiatric crisis. Megan sat in the chair in front of his desk and waited. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her expression was neutral the way a wall is neutral, present, but revealing nothing. She could have fought this. Could have spoken. Could have explained that she'd been assessing the man's mental state, reading his chemical indicators, waiting for the precise moment when his aggression would reach the predictable threshold she'd learned to recognize in training programs that had never officially been documented. Could have told him that Marcus would have died if she hadn't moved, that the tire iron was coming for the orderly's skull next, that every action she'd taken was defensive and measured and exactly right. She said nothing. "I'm suspending you, effective immediately," Pierce continued, his pen scratching across another form. "Pending termination review. Friday. You'll meet with the hospital attorney and the board to determine if," he paused, savoring this part, "if you can continue employment here at Cedar Creek Medical. I suspect they'll agree that we cannot maintain a functioning ER with staff who take matters into their own hands." "I protected," she began. "You assaulted a patient," he cut her off, his voice sharp as broken glass. "Everything else is interpretation. That's what we'll present to the board. Clear? Everything else is your version of events." She understood then. Understood with the clarity of someone who'd operated in environments where rules were tools and paperwork was a weapon and the smartest survival tactic was silence. He'd already decided. Had walked into this office with the narrative already constructed, had watched her neutralize a genuine threat and translated it into liability, had already begun the process of erasing her from Cedar Creek Medical the way she'd been erased from official records 3 years ago. She stood. Turned. Left his office without speaking. What happened next was not visible. Not to anyone in the hospital. But if anyone had been watching, really watching, they would have seen Dr. Pierce pick up his phone the moment his door closed, watched him dial the first of the 2 board members, heard him describe a problematic employee with behavioral concerns, would have seen him reference a security camera angle and mention a note in her file about previous incidents of instability. They would have watched him systematically move pieces around the board, disconnecting witnesses, erasing documentation, making calls to people who benefited from his continued presence at Cedar Creek Medical because those people were receiving portions of every medical device contract that came through his department. But nobody was watching. Nobody ever is, until suddenly everyone is. Megan drove home in silence. The roads were empty at midnight on a Tuesday, just the sound of her tires on wet asphalt and the rain that had started falling without announcement. Her apartment was dark when she arrived, and she sat at the kitchen table in the darkness for 43 minutes before turning on the light. The folded flag was where she kept it, in the drawer beside her bed, folded in the ceremonial triangle, the way they'd folded it at the memorial service for Mitchell, her medic partner from the 3rd rotation, the one she'd been holding when the IED detonated, the one she'd been applying pressure to for 7 minutes while calling for extraction, the one she'd had to leave behind when the helicopter came because staying meant losing the whole unit. She held the flag at the kitchen table. Her hands were steady. No trembling. No shaking. That came later, in private. That was the part of herself she'd learned to compartmentalize, to press down into the spaces between her ribs and only access when she was alone, when there was no one to see, no one to know that the competent nurse in the ER was built on top of a foundation of memories she'd been ordered to never speak about, classified into silence, erased into invisibility. Her daughter found her like that. Emily, 8 years old, home early from a sleepover at her grandmother's because Grandma had received a phone call from Megan's mother, something about Megan not sounding right when she'd called that afternoon, something about a tone in her voice that had triggered maternal alarm. Emily stood in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, her small backpack still on her shoulder, and asked the question that broke something Megan had kept sealed, "Mommy, why are you crying?" But that wasn't the worst part. Emily's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Mommy, why are you crying?" 8 years old, backpack still slung across her small shoulders, standing in the kitchen doorway in her purple pajamas with the little astronauts on them. Megan's hands went rigid around the folded flag. She tried to speak. Her throat closed. The silence stretched long enough for the kitchen faucet to drip once, twice, 3 times into the stainless steel sink. Megan set the flag down on the table with the care of a bomb technician. She turned to face her daughter, but Emily had already seen the answer in her mother's face, not the reason, never the reason, but the fact that something fundamental had shifted. The woman sitting at the kitchen table wasn't the quiet nurse who left every morning at 6:30 with perfectly organized scrubs and a packed lunch. This was someone else. Someone broken. Emily approached slowly, the way children do when they sense adult pain they don't have words for. She climbed into her mother's lap without asking. Megan pulled her close, breathing in the smell of her daughter's strawberry shampoo, and held on like Emily was the only thing keeping her tethered to earth. For 2 hours they sat that way. Emily dozed against her mother's chest. Megan stared at nothing, her hands moving in small circles on her daughter's back, the kind of repetitive motion that doesn't require thought. When Emily woke, she asked the questions that 8-year-olds ask. Why did you come home? Why are you sad? Is it because of Dr. Pierce? She'd heard that name at pickup once when another nurse parent mentioned hospital gossip. Megan almost laughed. Almost. The sound caught in her throat and came out wrong, like a car engine that wouldn't turn over. I did everything right, she whispered. The words came out like a prayer that had lost its God. I followed orders. I kept quiet. I did the work. I saved lives. I did everything right. Emily didn't understand. Her small hand found her mother's face and wiped a tear with the unconscious grace of childhood. You're the best nurse, Mommy. You help people all the time. You told me that. The words landed somewhere deep in the part of Megan that hadn't been buried with classified reports and redacted operations. She pulled Emily closer and made herself breathe, made herself present, made herself the mother her daughter needed instead of the ghost of the woman she'd tried to kill 3 years ago in Kandahar province. By the time Emily finally fell asleep for real, curled against her mother's side on the kitchen chair like a cat, Megan had made a decision. She didn't fully understand it yet, but she felt it crystallize in her chest like ice forming on a winter lake. She couldn't control what Pierce did. She couldn't control the hospital board or the termination paperwork or any of the machinery that was grinding toward her destruction. But she also knew something he didn't know. She knew that security badges worked on 2-way systems. She knew the code to the loading dock because she'd helped the facility manager unlock it once when his hands were full of supply boxes. She knew the hospital better than anyone, every corridor, every stairwell, every back entrance. And she knew her patients. She picked up the folded flag from the table and held it against her chest. The fabric was worn soft from 18 years of careful storage. Inside that flag was her last tie to the woman she'd been. To Captain Megan O'Brien, who'd held a surgical line under fire. Who'd kept 12 soldiers breathing with improvised equipment and pure will. Who'd watched her team leader, her friend, her brother, bleed out in the dust and then saved the next 5 lives because the alternative was surrender. The hospital suspended her pending termination. Official paperwork was processed the next morning at 8:17. The system ran a routine background check as protocol required for all personnel separations. It was supposed to be clean. It wasn't supposed to find anything. But the system pinged on something buried deep, a classified security clearance embedded in records that weren't supposed to exist. Automated flags triggered. An HR director named Christine Young received a notification that made her coffee go cold. Further information requires authorization. She called Pierce immediately, confusion bleeding through the phone line. "It's a glitch," he said. "Push it through anyway. Flag it as a system error. I'll handle the notification personally." He wouldn't. She suspected that even as she heard him say it. But she also knew she was a contract employee working in a hospital whose chief of surgery had political friends with the kind of leverage that made minor problems disappear. What she didn't know was that the flag had already triggered something at Fort Bragg. A low-level alert in a system that nobody paid attention to anymore, keyword scanning for buried clearances, classified operations, names that weren't supposed to be activated. The system was old. The algorithm was older. But it worked. Meanwhile, Torres deteriorated. The pneumonia complications that should have been manageable became fluid accumulation in his chest cavity. His oxygen saturation started dropping at around 2 in the afternoon. The attending physician ordered observation, conservative management, wait and see. Torres had been a good patient, complained little, followed instructions, understood the protocols. He'd spent 30 years as a Marine medic. He knew how these things unfolded. When he saw the new nurse assigned to his care, a graduate nurse, maybe 2 months past her licensing exam, moving with the careful precision of someone terrified of breaking something, he recognized the signature of Pierce's work immediately. The best nurses got reassigned. That happened when doctors were eliminating witnesses. He thought about that tactical detail as his oxygen started to fall. 78%. 72. His chest felt compressed, like someone had parked a car on his sternum. He pressed his call button. The new nurse came, checked his vitals, looked worried, called the attending. The attending was in surgery. Would be for another 2 hours. They'd monitor. They'd keep watching. Torres didn't have 2 hours. Neither did his lungs. The code blue announcement crackled across Cedar Creek Medical's network at 3:02 in the morning. Cardiac monitors screaming across the hospital intercom. Trauma Bay 7. It took 5 seconds for code team to mobilize, 30 seconds for the first doctor to arrive. Torres was already gray, the kind of gray that meant not enough oxygen, not enough time. 3 miles away, Megan was sitting in her car in the parking lot, hands on the steering wheel, eyes open but unseeing. She'd come back at midnight. She told herself she was getting her personal items from her locker, but she'd known even then that was a lie. She was waiting. Listening. Her old trauma radio, a relic from her last assignment, was broadcasting Cedar Creek's network because she'd never cancelled the frequency. When the code blue hit, her hands moved before her brain caught up. She was out of the car, through the loading dock door that still recognized her badge, up the back stairs that smelled of industrial cleaner and night. Her body remembered the way. Muscle memory was a language that didn't forget, that couldn't unlearn. Torres's room was chaos in the organized way that hospital codes become chaos, people moving with purpose, voices calling out numbers and orders, the wheezing hiss of a ventilator, nobody breathing in sync because there wasn't time to. The attending was frozen at the foot of the bed. The new nurse was pale, pressing compressions with the right rhythm but the wrong desperation. The equipment was failing. The monitor showed a dangerous downward slope. Nobody saw Megan until she was already moving. She didn't announce herself. She simply appeared at Torres's bedside like a thought made flesh, her hands moving to find the landmark she'd found 1,000 times in 1,000 different conditions. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She found a sterile 14-gauge needle on the crash cart, her movements precise and practiced enough that even in the chaos, someone noticed and didn't stop her. The needle went in. The hiss of air, pressure releasing, lungs re-inflating, oxygen saturation starting to climb. 75. 80. 85. Torres's color shifted from gray toward human. His breathing synchronized with the ventilator. His chest stopped that panicked rise and fall. She was still guiding the needle home, her hand steady as a surgical laser, when Pierce arrived with security 2 steps behind him. He saw her first, saw her hands on Torres's chest, saw the monitor climbing, and everything he'd spent the last 48 hours building, the reassigned witnesses, the altered security footage, the calls to board members, the narrative of her instability, flashed through his mind as suddenly irrelevant. "Get her out of here," he said. The words came out clipped, wrong. "You're trespassing. I want her arrested. This moment. Now." The security guard stepped forward, hesitated. "She just saved that patient's life. She has no authority here." Pierce's voice rose, strategic composure cracking like thin ice. "She's fired. Her suspension was for—" Torres's hand came up with surprising strength, one oxygen-deprived fist gripping Pierce's wrist. His voice was barely a whisper, barely human, but it carried the weight of 30 years of combat medicine. "Don't touch, Captain." Pierce yanked his hand back. "Captain of what? The nursing?" A woman's voice cut across the room, sharp and rising. Torres's daughter, phone in hand, reading from the screen. Her father had shown her earlier, something he'd found in declassified military records, his way of saying thank you without words. Captain Megan O'Brien, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Kandahar province. Her voice shook. United States Army Special Forces. Medical operations under sustained hostile fire. 12 soldiers sustained in theater. The citation continued, each phrase hitting like a hammer blow into still water. The room went dead silent. Not the silence of operating rooms or libraries. The silence that comes when a fundamental truth reorganizes itself in front of you. Pierce stood frozen, his hands empty, his face the color of old newspaper. He tried again, but the words came out hollow. "This is ridiculous. She's fabricating some military fantasy. A nurse who can't handle criticism, and now." The elevator chimed. Boot steps on tile. 1, 2, 3, for a military cadence, precise and inevitable. From the corridor came a man in a hospital gown, moving like the gown was a uniform he'd earned. Torres's roommate from the cardiac wing, the retired Marine colonel, coming at a walk that looked like it should have been a run. When he saw Megan's face, he stopped. Really stopped. The kind of stop that meant recognition, and deeper, the 1,000-yard stare she'd worn for 3 years finally visible to someone who'd worn it himself. "What was your call sign, Captain?" His voice was gentle, the way people speak in hospitals and churches. Megan couldn't answer. Her breath came in short gasps. Her hands were trembling for the first time anyone had witnessed, the trembling not of fear but of restraint finally snapping. The colonel understood without response. He pulled out his phone, made a call, found a military forum where veterans discussed redacted operations. When he found it, he read aloud, "Call sign Mercer 6. Field hospital under sustained fire. 18-hour emergency surgical operation with failing equipment and zero supply chain. Single medical officer sustained the surgical line. 12 combatants remained operational for extraction." The crowd in the corridor grew. A surgical resident's mouth fell open. A veteran janitor snapped to attention without thinking. 2 nurses gripped each other's arms like they were watching something sacred. Pierce interrupted, voice dripping with contempt, "Captain of what? The nursing?" The main entrance doors burst open. Cool Savannah air rushed into the corridor along with boot steps that carried absolute authority. A 2-star general, arriving for his scheduled cardiac consultation, stopped mid-stride when he saw the crowd, saw Megan through the bodies, saw her face, and something shifted in his expression to recognition. He walked to her locker, someone had opened it during the chaos, and saw the bronze star pinned inside next to the folded flag from Kandahar. His hand rose in salute, parade ground sharp. "Captain O'Brien," he said. His voice carried down the corridor like a command. "Operation Resolute Guardian. Kandahar Province. You held that aid station for 18 hours under direct fire. You performed a field amputation with a combat knife. Your team leader didn't make it home. Neither did your records because what you did was so classified they buried you with the operation. Each sentence detonated. The corridor filled with gasping breath, whispered conversations, phones appearing because this moment was too large for silence. And you wrote her up for saving a patient's life? The general turned to Pierce, and his gaze had the weight of medals and command authority. His words were quiet, but they carried the force of an entire career. 34 years of service. 42 military commendations. The kind of man who'd trained future generals. Pierce's face drained of color. No words came. There were no words that fit this moment. A phone appeared, someone filming. The video would capture everything, Pierce's sneer frozen on his face, the general's salute held in perfect military precision, Megan's tears finally breaking through stoic walls, the moment when the quiet nurse became visible, when the buried truth surfaced, when the entire architectural structure of what Pierce had built began to collapse into rubble. 48 hours after the suspension papers landed on her kitchen table, the system flagged everything. HR ran the standard background check, a formality, a procedural box to tick before filing her termination. Instead, the database returned something that shouldn't exist. A classified security clearance, buried in layers of redacted documentation. The kind of record that triggers automatic alerts to federal agencies. The kind of thing that makes government phones ring at 4 a.m. By 6 a.m., Cedar Creek's HR director was on the phone with someone she couldn't name. By 7 a.m., 2 agents in dark suits were reviewing Megan's personnel file in the hospital administrator's office. By 8 a.m., the entire termination process had frozen mid-motion, suspended in bureaucratic amber while people with very high clearances decided what to do about a nurse who wasn't supposed to exist on any official hospital record. Megan didn't know any of this yet. She was in the break room at 7:15 a.m., holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago, staring at nothing, when Colonel James Torres, retired Marine, 43 years old, admitted Thursday with pneumonia that was slowly destroying his left lung, found her in the corridor outside his room. He'd been watching her move through the hospital since admission. The way she pivoted on her heel. The way her eye scanned rooms before entering them. The way her hands moved with absolute precision, as if muscle memory ran deeper than thought. He recognized the 1,000-yard stare because he'd seen it in every mirror for 20 years after Helmand Province. "Captain," he said quietly, catching her arm as she passed his room. Megan stopped. Turned. Her face gave nothing away, but her jaw tightened, just once, imperceptible to most people. Torres saw it. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "First SFOD Delta." She didn't answer. "Then why are your hands steady enough to thread a needle in a moving ambulance?" Torres's voice was low, calibrated to a frequency only she could hear. "Why do you move like you're still clearing rooms? Why do you have scars on your ribs that don't match any car accident?" Megan was already walking. Torres followed her to the stairwell, his oxygen line trailing behind him like a leash. "Sir, you need to return to your room." Captain Megan O'Brien. The name hung in the concrete space between them like a bullet fired decades ago finally reaching its target. Megan's hand went rigid on the stair railing. Torres pulled out his phone. His daughter had texted him a link an hour ago, something she'd found while researching military history for a school project. He scrolled to the declassified citation, the one that had been partially released 3 years ago when a Freedom of Information Act request exposed fragments of an operation buried so deep that most of Congress didn't know it happened. For extraordinary heroism during combat operations in support of Operation Enduring Freedom, Torres read aloud, his voice steady as a metronome. Captain Megan O'Brien distinguished herself through exceptional tactical leadership and medical innovation under enemy fire, directly saving the lives of 17 personnel during the Valley of Imam extraction. Her actions exemplified the highest standards of courage and military excellence. He kept reading, standing there in a hospital gown with an oxygen line draped across his shoulders, speaking the words that Megan had spent 3 years trying to leave behind. Other nurses emerged from rooms. An orderly stopped mid-hallway. A doctor walking toward the pediatric ward slowed, phone half raised. "That's enough," Megan said. But it wasn't. Torres was reading the part they'd never redacted, the part that mattered. The confirmation that the operation was real. That her name was real. That she was real. The crowd was growing now. 12 people. 15. 20. Phones appearing like flowers blooming in fast motion. Then Dr. Pierce pushed through. His face was already red, that particular shade of apoplectic that comes from losing control of a narrative. He'd been in his office, had heard the murmurs, had come to shut this down with whatever authority he still possessed. Captain of what? The nursing. A voice interrupted him. "At ease, Doctor." The general arrived like a weather pattern shifting, like the air pressure changing before a storm. 2 stars on his shoulder, uniform immaculate, and eyes that had seen every terrible thing the world could offer and had chosen compassion anyway. He was a cardiac consult, here to see a post-op patient. Instead, he was stepping into a corridor where a decorated veteran was reading the classified history of a woman who'd been buried under a civilian identity. The general stepped past Pierce, actually stepped past him, dismissing him with the physics of his body, and approached Megan's locker. The Bronze Star was there, pinned inside, visible only if you looked. She'd kept it hidden for 3 years, unable to wear it, unable to leave it behind. He looked at the medal. Then at Megan. Then he saluted. Not a casual gesture. A full, precise salute, the kind you give to a fallen soldier at a funeral, the kind you give to someone who embodied everything a uniform is supposed to mean. His arm bent at exactly 90 degrees, fingers extended, held for the count that tradition demanded. "Captain," he said, and his voice carried the weight of every commendation, every ceremony, every moment when warriors are recognized by those who understand what they've paid. "Your service was noted. Your sacrifice was honored. Welcome home." Pierce's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. Like something that had lost its element. Like something that understood, finally, that it was drowning. A bystander, a respiratory therapist who'd been standing at the end of the corridor, had captured it all. The salute. The Bronze Star. Pierce's face frozen mid-sneer, his mouth twisted into an expression that would soon be screenshot across 3 continents. The moment when the quiet nurse became visible. When the invisible rank revealed itself. When the entire power structure that Dr. Pierce had built came down like dominoes knocked by a 2-star general standing in a hospital corridor. The video was online by 8:51 a.m. Hashtag Dr. Mox War Hero. Hashtag out of the veterans' files. Hashtag show some respect. By noon, it had 340,000 views. By 3 p.m., 2.1 million. By 6 p.m., 3 military advocacy organizations had launched formal inquiries. The American Medical Association had received 74 complaints about Pierce's conduct. The hospital's main line ran continuously, veterans groups, news stations, journalists who sensed a story that cut deeper than just one doctor's cruelty. This was a story about invisible service. About the warriors among us who'd learned to move through the world without claiming space. About a system that tried to erase the very people it should have protected. Megan sat at the edge of her daughter's bed at 7:56 p.m., Emily asleep beside her, phone scrolling through a story she couldn't stop reading. Her own name, repeated across websites. Her own face, from the hospital ID that suddenly wasn't secret anymore, captured in a salute with a 2-star general beside her. The Bronze Star, glinting in phone light. Everything she'd buried, everything she'd swallowed, everything she'd carried in silence now displayed across the collective consciousness of the internet. She thought about the moment Emily would wake up. About the conversation that would happen at breakfast. About explaining that her quiet mother, the one who worked nights and came home tired, the one who said nothing about her past, had been ordered to bury it. That the medals, the citations, the operation in Kandahar, all of it was real, and she'd been forbidden from speaking about it. That the truth would not come from her, but from a viral moment and a 2-star general and a man in a hospital gown who'd recognized her 1,000-yard stare. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she didn't have a choice anymore about her own narrative. Someone else would tell it now. The internet would tell it. The news cycle would shape it. And Megan, who'd spent 3 years learning to be invisible, who'd made silence into an art form, who'd translated her entire existence into the language of invisible service, would have to find a way to step into the light and claim the story before others defined it for her. She kissed Emily's forehead. She walked to the kitchen. She opened her laptop. And for the first time in 3 years, she began to write the truth, not for the military archives or the redacted files or the classified operations, but for Emily. For the nurses who would follow her. For a public that had been shown a glimpse of what they didn't know about the people around them. She'd been ordered to bury the war. She'd followed that order with everything she had. But the war had surfaced anyway. And now, Megan O'Brien had to decide whether she would let others tell her story or whether she would finally tell it herself. Whether she would remain invisible or whether she would step into the spotlight and claim the narrative before the next viral moment tried to reshape it. The screen glowed. She began to type. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your full story, please like and subscribe. Share this video with someone you know who's been told their voice doesn't matter, because the quietest people often have the most powerful stories to tell. And comment below, what would you do if the truth about you suddenly went viral?